So who's the real villain in this story? The monster with the claws, the tyrant with the crown, or the voice in your head that says, "This isn't fair, you deserve more"? We like to believe villains are out there, lurking, scheming, separate. But that's a lie we tell ourselves to feel safe. Because the truth, the villain might already be here, not in your enemies, not in your past, but in the version of you that you've refused to face. Most people imagine evil as some great explosion, a snap, a scream, a final fatal moment to some. But the descent doesn't start with destruction, it starts with denial, a whisper, a compromise, a choice not to feel something that hurts or acknowledge something that's true. Psychologist Carl Jung called it the shadow, the parts of ourselves we bury, anger, envy, bitterness, the desire to hurt what hurt us, the impulse to control what we can't. We shove those pieces down, pretend they don't exist, and wear the mask the world expects. But what we bury doesn't die, it waits. And when the moment comes when we're slighted or ignored or finally given power, the shadow doesn't whisper anymore. It speaks, clearly, persuasively. And it sounds like you. You've heard it. We all have. The quiet satisfaction when someone fails. The fantasy of putting someone in their place. The thrill of imagining what you'd do if there were no rules. That's the whisper. And if you've heard it even once, then you already know villains aren't born. They're grown, piece by piece, decision by decision. Not in some distant land, but inside ordinary lives. Inside people who look a lot like us. We tell ourselves we'd never go that far, that we're different. But the most dangerous villains didn't think they were villains either. They thought they were right, justified, reasonable, until the thing inside them grew stronger than the part that said, "Stop, Aiden." And that's where it begins, not with violence, not with hatred, but with silence. The silence where a part of you waits to be heard. The silence you mistake for virtue because it keeps you in control. But silence can become a seed. And if you feed it with fear or hurt or pride, it grows into something you no longer recognized. So who's the real villain in this story? Maybe it's not the man behind the curtain. Maybe it's the part of you that stepped aside, looked away, and let the whisper become the voice. Because that whisper, it's still there. And the story has just begun. It never starts with a scream. It starts with a reason. Something that feels just enough like truth to ignore the weight of what comes next. An excuse dressed up as justice. A wound mistaken for clarity. A voice that says, "You're not the bad guy. You're the one who finally got tired of losing it." And then, the first step, not a leap, just a shift. A decision that feels small, harmless, necessary. He told himself it was about protection, about fairness, about claiming what was his. But deep down, something else had moved. He liked how it felt to stop apologizing. He didn't have a name anyone remembered. He worked a job no one noticed. Showed up, stayed quiet, swallowed his pride until it began to burn. And one day he stopped swallowing. His name was Daniel. And if you knew him then, you would have called him decent, tired maybe, frustrated. But decent. That's what makes it dangerous, because Daniel didn't break. He shifted slowly, quietly. At first it was just withholding credit from someone who didn't deserve it. Then it was setting a trap for someone he knew would fall into it. And when they did, he didn't flinch. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, control. And once you taste control, it's hard to go back to swallowing. In 1971, a psychologist ran an experiment. Stanford, a mock prison. College students, randomly assigned as guards or prisoners. Within days, the guards became cruel. They locked their classmates in closets, humiliated them, stripped them of names, turned them into numbers. The experiment had to be shut down in 6 days. 6 days not because they were evil, but because they were told, "This is who you are now," and they believed it. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo called it the Lucifer effect, the transformation of good people under the pressure of power, role, and permission. It doesn't require a villain's heart, just a system that looks the other way, and a person who stops asking questions with it. But that's not where it ends, because the mind won't let you see yourself as cruel. So it builds a story, a myth, wrong. A narrative that paints every action as necessary, strategic, even noble. Psychologist Albert Bandura called it moral disengagement, the way we rewrite our actions to stay the hero of our own story. It's not vengeance, it's discipline, it's not manipulation, it's leadership, it's not personal, it's just business. And Daniel, he kept going, he got better at it, sharper, more composed. He became the one people feared, then followed, not because he was loud, but because he never flinched. If you'd asked him, he wouldn't have called himself a villain. He would have said he was realistic, focused, efficient. But the truth, he had forgotten who he was. And when you forget who you were, you stop noticing what you've become. So who's the real villain in this story? Maybe it's not the one who snapped. Maybe it's the one who kept choosing again and again to believe that control was more important than conscience. And if you've ever felt like Daniel, if you've ever wanted to stop swallowing and start striking, then you already know how close the edge really is, and how easy it is to keep walking. So who's the real villain in this story? The devil in the scripture, the fallen king in legend, or the part of you that still believes you're the exception? Long before we had diagnoses, we had myths. Before psychology spoke of shadows and disassociation, stories whispered warnings in the dark, and in every story the villain was never just an enemy. He was a lesson, a reflection, a question you weren't ready to answer. Lucifer wasn't cast down because he was weak. He was cast down because he refused to bow. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That line isn't terrifying because it's evil. It's terrifying because it's familiar. Because who among us in a quiet moment hasn't wanted to stop being overlooked and start being obeyed? In Sumerian myth, the goddess Inanna descends into the underworld. There she meets Ereshkigal, her sister, her opposite, her shadow. It's not a battle, it's a confrontation. Light meeting dark, the divine meeting the forgotten. She isn't destroyed, she's remade. Stripped of her titles, her pride, her masks, until nothing is left but the truth of who she is. That's what myths are for. Not entertainment, initiation. They teach you how to survive the storm inside. And the villain, he isn't a mistake in the story, he's the price of ignoring it. Carl Jung called these figures archetypes, deep psychological truths wrapped in narrative. The villain isn't some outside force. He's the manifestation of what happens when you abandon integration, when you split light from shadow and pretend only one matters, and when you deny your shadow, it doesn't vanish. It festers. You see it in others. You project it onto enemies. You wage wars not against injustice, but against what you fear in yourself. You start calling others monsters because it's easier than asking what you're capable of becoming. Even the Bible doesn't start with peace. It starts with murder. Cain and Abel, two brothers, one accepted, one rejected. And in that rejection, something ancient wakes up. God doesn't condemn Cain. He warns him. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. But Cain doesn't, and how many of us have? Because villainy isn't about being consumed by darkness. It's about giving it the keys. It's what happens when we mistake pain for purpose. When we decide the wound we carry is more valuable than the healing we fear. In the myth of Prometheus, fire is stolen from the gods, a defiant act, a gift to humanity. But beneath the heroism is another truth, the desire to challenge power, to be the one who decides who deserves the flame. That's the seed, not the theft, but the pride in deciding what should burn. Villains don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as liberators, as saviors, as gods. And maybe that's what makes them so dangerous. Because you don't fear a man who knows he's wrong. You fear the one who thinks he's right. So who's the real villain in this story? Maybe it's not the god who fell. Maybe it's the voice inside you that still whispers, if I had the power, I'd do it differently. And maybe that's exactly what the last villain said too. So who's the real villain in this story? The one who pulled the trigger? Or the one watching from the dark thinking, I get it, you don't have to say it out loud, but it's there. That moment in a film, in a book, in a headline, when the villain says something so sharp, so painfully honest, that you find yourself nodding. Not because you agree, but because something in you has felt that same heat. That's the crack in the mirror. We're not drawn to villains because they're evil. We're drawn to them because they stop lying. They let the mask fall. They say the quiet thing out loud. And in a world obsessed with pretending, that kind of honesty feels like power. In 2020, a study confirmed it. People weren't identifying with heroes. They were identifying with villains, especially the ones who reminded them of themselves. If you saw yourself as cunning, you leaned toward the Joker. If you prized ambition, Voldemort made sense. It wasn't about admiration, it was about recognition. The truth is, we don't always want to be the hero. The hero plays by the rules. The hero gets hurt, the hero waits. But the villain takes, speaks, moves. And when you've spent your life being told to be quiet, be kind, be patient, watching someone say enough becomes electric. But here's the danger. Because fiction is safe, we think the identification is harmless. But every time we cheer for vengeance, or laugh at cruelty, or whisper finally when someone breaks the rules, we're feeding something. Maybe not enough to destroy us, but enough to change what we tolerate, what we celebrate, what we become. Frankenstein's creature wasn't born a monster. He was made one by rejection, by isolation, by the refusal of others to see his humanity. I am malicious, he says, because I am miserable. And in that line, we don't see a monster. We see ourselves when we were most alone. That's the secret no one wants to admit. The villain isn't always evil. Sometimes he's just the one who finally broke. And if that scares you, it should, because the longer you stare at him, the more familiar he looks. Not because you are him, but because you could be. You felt the same hunger, the same hurt, the same desire to make someone pay or finally listen or see you. You've thought it. Maybe you've whispered it. Maybe you've stopped yourself just in time. Or maybe you didn't. And that's where the mirror becomes dangerous, because villains don't arrive with fangs. They arrive with reasons, with wounds, with stories that sound a lot like yours. So who's the real villain in this story? Maybe it's not the man with the plan. Maybe it's the part of you that watched him fall and wondered what it would feel like to let go just once and stop pretending you were any different. So who's the real villain in this story? The one who lost control, or the one who stopped needing to? There's a moment in every descent when the noise inside goes quiet. No more second guessing, no more rationalizing. Just a cold, calculated rhythm. A switch flips, not in rage, but in resolve. And that's when you know the mask isn't something you wear anymore. It's who you are. At first it was about making things right. Then it was about proving a point. Then it was about not backing down. But now it's not about anything. It's just who you've become. This is the stage no one wants to talk about. Not the beginning, not the fall, but what happens after the lines have been crossed, after the conscience has gone quiet, after the soul has adapted to the dark. And the scariest part doesn't feel like evil, it feels efficient. Friedrich Nietzsche tried to warn us. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. But he wasn't just talking about violence. He was talking about obsession, about staring at something so long, corruption, injustice, betrayal, that it changes you. Until one day you're not fighting the monster anymore, you're mirroring it. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Most people don't understand that part. They think it means the darkness watches back, but it's worse than that. It means the longer you stare into what's broken, the more it begins to make sense. You start seeing the world the way the villain does, not as right or wrong, just useful or not. And in that place, empathy becomes noise. Morality becomes a liability. Remorse becomes irrelevant. This is where the villain stops pretending to be a savior, where he no longer needs a reason, where he builds systems instead of stories, orders instead of explanations. This is where the evil isn't loud, it's organized. Stanley Milgram saw it happen in a lab. Participants were instructed to deliver electric shocks to strangers behind a curtain. Screams echoed, pleas for mercy. But a man in a lab coat told them to continue, so they did, most of them, increasing the voltage, following instructions, just doing their job. No anger, no malice, just obedience. Hannah Arendt saw it on a global scale. She watched Adolf Eichmann, a man who orchestrated logistics for genocide, explain himself not with rage, but with paperwork, with protocols, with polite indifference. She didn't see a demon in chains. She saw a man in a suit, neat, controlled, unthinking. She called it the banality of evil, not because evil is boring, but because it's efficient, predictable, systemic. A man files a form, a button gets pressed, a life disappears, and no one cries, because no one feels. That's the final transformation. Not madness, not fury, just indifference. You don't become the villain by hating, you become the villain by stopping the questions, stopping the doubt, stopping the part of you that used to care. And when someone finally asks how it got this far, the answer won't be dramatic. It'll be something like, I had a job to do. That's when you know you're no longer walking toward the abyss. You are it. So who's the real villain in this story? Maybe it's not the one who burned with fury. Maybe it's the one who forgot what fire even felt like. So who's the real villain in this story? The one who couldn't be saved, or the one who never tried? Every story ends somewhere, but not every story ends honestly. Some villains fall in battle, some vanish into legend, some are destroyed by the very thing they created. But the ones that stay with us, the ones that haunt us, are the ones who understood, even for a moment, what they had become, because the greatest tragedy isn't doing wrong. It's realizing you didn't have to. We talk about redemption like it's a destination, like it's a soft light waiting at the end of a tunnel, but that's a lie. Redemption isn't poetic, it's brutal. It requires something villains rarely give: truth. The truth about what they did, why they did it, who they hurt, and the part of themselves they silenced to get there. There are stories of those who faced that truth, not many, but enough. A man who led with blood and died trying to clean it. A killer who taught others how to walk away from hate. A monster who stopped pretending and spent the rest of his life speaking to children about peace. Not saints, not heroes, just men who finally said no more. They didn't erase what they did, they carried it. And that weight, that willingness to feel again, is what made them something more than villains. But most don't get there because it's easier to stay the monster, to hide behind power or fear or silence. It's easier to double down, to convince yourself that your story is done, that your mask is who you are now. But that's never true, because even in the darkest myth something remains. A crack, a flicker, a choice. Cain was marked after he killed his brother, not just as a curse, but as a reminder that you don't walk away from what you've done. You carry it, you answer to it, you live with the weight, and sometimes you make it mean something. You've seen the descent, you've walked through the shadow, you've looked into the eyes of those who stopped feeling, and now you've looked into the mirror. And maybe you've seen something you didn't want to. Good, because seeing it means you're still here. The villain doesn't begin with evil. He begins with avoidance, with silence, with the choice to stay comfortable instead of accountable. But the hero, he begins the moment you decide not to look away, even from yourself. So if you've made it this far, there's one question left. What now? You've seen the story, felt the pull. You know how close the edge really is. And if that voice inside you still whispers, "That could have been me," then listen to it, because that whisper is your chance. The shadow will always be part of you, but it doesn't have to rule you. Name it, face it, use it, not to harm, but to understand, to see others, to protect what matters, to build something instead of burn it, because the greatest rebellion isn't rage, it's responsibility. So who's the real villain in this story? Maybe it's the one who saw the truth and did nothing, and maybe, just maybe, say, it won't be you. If this made you feel something, don't keep it quiet, share it, because someone else is standing at the edge, and one story can be all it takes to pull them back.